sleep alone tonight. They said our love could take it fast like big city life. Well, this small town love was southern Maine, sweeter than sugar tea lemonade. We had midnight walks, late night talk, line dancing in the Georgia rain. Being home without you just ain't the same when all I got are empty beer bottles and empty picture frames. You and I couldn't wait to graduate, go chase our freedom down the interstate. When you and I said our goodbyes, I held my breath as I watched my mama cry. She said we'd make it, but I sleep alone tonight. She said our love could take it fast like big city life. But this small town love was southern Maine, sweeter than sugar tea lemonade. We had midnight walks, late night talk, line dancing in the Georgia rain. Being home without you just ain't the same when all I got are empty beer bottles and empty picture frames. All your empty picture frames. I gave the city all I could give. Your love and the way we lived. But I needed to go, you needed to stay. I wasn't built that way. This small town love was southern made, sweeter than sugar tea lemonade. We had midnight walks, late night talk, line dancing in the Georgia rain. Being home without you just ain't the same when all I got are empty beer bottles and empty picture frames. All I got, all I got, all your empty picture frames. You and I are dancing under my porch light. You've come back home, and it feels so right. Don't it feel so right? When I hear Blake Shelton.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Leading Forward, our summer speaker series. That was actually Amma Lieb who was singing. So if you heard our first series, she was part of our summer kickoff concert. My name is Kate Treitman Brown. I graduated from Nobles in 1999 and I'm back working as the Director of Graduate Affairs. We know that you have many options this summer and tonight for what to tune into, so we really appreciate you spending 45 minutes with us this evening. And we have a fantastic program, one that I've been looking forward to for the whole series. Thank you so much to the Grad Council and to the tech team for helping us to connect with you virtually this summer. A quick reminder before we start this evening's presentation, which is that next week is actually our final event in the speaker series. We have a really exciting program, and just a quick note that it is on Wednesday, Wednesday night, July 22nd at 5 p.m. as opposed to our usual Tuesday evening time. That event will be with two members of the class of 1974, Paul Ayub and Harry Elam, who's the incoming president at Occidental College. And Paul and Harry will be talking about the state of higher education, so not to be missed, a hot topic. I'm excited to introduce our speakers, and I'll ask them to start their video so we can see them. We will hear from our speakers, and then we will have a Q&A session. If you have a question during the session, feel free to pop it into the Q&A box, but you'll also have an option if you prefer to ask the question in person during that session at the end. So I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists. Steve Ginsburg, who is one of Noble's own. He's the Chief Financial and Operating Officer at Noble's, and he's actually been at Noble's for 21 years. In addition to coaching soccer here, he also teaches a fascinating class on entrepreneurship to seniors. And that's part of the reason why we've asked him to interview Kevin tonight. So thanks to Steve for chatting with Kevin. Kevin O'Mara, who graduated in 1980, is the principal thought leader at Amazon. After he graduated from Nobles, he went on to earn a BA in economics from Boston College and a master's in industrial relations from Oxford University and an MBA from Stanford University. From 2011 to 2015, he was a senior research fellow at the Stanford Business School, and he's also a distinguished fellow with the Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Tennessee. And he's been in that role since 2015. So Kevin built two companies within the business of supply chains, SCM and AMR Research, and sold them both to Gartner. He also created the Supply Chain Top 25, as well as Gartner's Supply Chain University rankings. And then Kevin joined Amazon in 2018 as the director who was tasked with building communities for partnerships for the Amazon ecosystem, including retail suppliers, delivery providers, and others, something many of us know intimately in our daily lives, especially now. His purpose in his role is to improve the adoption of operations technology by these groups and to develop better collaborative programs within Amazon's consumer supply chain. So Steve and Kevin, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Kate. Admittedly, I had this fantasy of an Oprah-like career rise after this night, and then I started watching all of the names come in on the chat, and I got really nervous because there are people on there that I haven't talked to or seen in a long time, and a lot of very fond memories of people that I've coached or taught or been on trips with as part of the Nobles Excel program. So now I'm hoping that this goes well. The other piece to that is, since many of you know me, you may be wondering, how is Steve teaching a class on entrepreneurship? Because he's been at Nobles for 21 years. I don't think he's ever been an entrepreneur. And what does he know about supply chains, which is not much. And I hope to learn a lot from Kevin today. But the hope is, that, as Kate said, I teach a class to juniors and seniors, an elective called Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And the focus of the class, a lot of it is introducing kids to people who have been innovators in different spaces, and really just hearing their stories. And what's been kind of unique and exciting is that the Nobles community has connections to people in all different industries. And Kevin is another example of that. And I think our hope tonight is that in many ways, Kevin can just tell and share his story. I will ask some questions in a limited way from what I know about supply chains, but the hope is that Kevin can share his stories. And then if you guys have questions, that would be great. So my hope is that to start, looking back, and one of the shared things that all of us, I think, on this call have is a connection to Nobles. And Kevin started a little while ago as a student at Nobles. So I was hoping that to start, Kevin, you'd be willing to share with the group kind of your path from when you maybe even entered Nobles to when you left Nobles to today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. And it's really fun to think about Nobles with this much perspective with you and Kate both as Nobles affiliates. It really kind of brings me back. I guess I started at Nobles as a sophomore and wasn't a particularly good student. Those who were in the class of 80 will attest to my lack of attention to the school buildings. I was significantly more focused on the football field, the lacrosse field, and really basically was all about getting out of practice. But one thing in particular kind of stuck with me out of Nobles, and it was the class I took in public speaking with Nick Marinaro. I know I'm not the only one who was impacted by Nick Marinaro as a teacher and as a coach, but he gave me a class of public speaking, which is something that I have used practically every day of my life since. I was kind of inspired coming out of Nobles to get into business, and I had a pretty hazy idea, like most kids getting out of high school, what that meant. So I went out to college and took economics, which struck me as a logical path. But the entire time I was really kind of interested in manufacturing. I always was interested in materials and engineering, and spent a lot of time in those kinds of physical work environments. So I thought I would go off and try to get involved in a manufacturing world. This led me to the industrial relations path, and found that as much as I wanted to work in a factory, turns out the decisions get made elsewhere. And what I discovered was there's a whole lot more to understanding the process of the way a business works and the governance of the work itself. So how do you lead people? And then ultimately, the information, which is kind of where we are today in this digital universe, is how does the information tie all this stuff together? And that kind of drew me to the tech world. After spending a few years in the consulting industry, I came out of Stanford, did some process reengineering for a while for a company that is now part of Ernst & Young. I know there's some Nobles folks out there who are EY folks. And then I went in tech. I got a job at Oracle out in Silicon Valley, responsible for basically designing some of the applications that big manufacturing companies use to run their supply chain. And frankly, Steve, we didn't really even call it supply chain back in those days. It was planning and it was logistics and it was purchasing and stuff like that. But as it evolved, and what Kate described, these two companies that I was a research leader at, AMR Research, which was Boston-based, SCM World, which was London-based, both of those were about understanding not just the economics, not just the management process, but the information technology. And that turned out to be the really important lever in all of this, and is kind of how I ended up at Amazon now, which is a place that is steeped in the application of technology to solve these supply chain problems. So that's a quick condensed version of from Nobles to Amazon, but that's where I am now.
Okay. So in the world of supply chain, because like me, maybe there are others on the call who don't have a firm handle on kind of what that means in general, but maybe more specifically what it means at Amazon. There's been so much attention on deliveries and supply chain and getting things, whether it's to essential workers or to people's homes. Can you talk a little bit about what supply chain means and kind of why it's been gotten so much attention in recent times?
Yeah, Steve, supply chain is a term that's kind of a crusty old industrial sounding term, and it has some pretty bad semantic legacy. It just doesn't sound cool. Amazon makes it sound a little cooler because you know Amazon and it's tech and it's out there and you see those vans and those trucks. That's the tail end of the supply chain. We call that the last mile, and that's the delivery. It's not just about the delivery though, and most of what I did prior to Amazon was further up the supply chain. So I often say the best way to understand supply chain for the general public is it is the explanation of where everything comes from. The supply chain is how you get medicine, how you get clothing, how you get insulation in your home, how you get gasoline in your car, where it comes from in the planet, how it gets converted in the process of manufacturing, and then ultimately delivered to your house. Amazon's been really visible of late because with the pandemic, and people being stuck at home, the volume of ordering online has really surged. And as a result, Amazon and other online delivery capabilities have become really visible. And to a certain extent, it's become somewhat heroic. I mean, I've been able to listen to some customer service desk calls that are almost tearful in their gratitude for their delivery guys showing up and bringing them the stuff that they need. So that's the very last mile of the supply chain. But the truth of it is it goes all the way back, and I've been to these places, to the iron mines in Western Australia, or to plantations, out in the Midwest, or to plastics manufacturing facilities up in Alberta. Everything ultimately starts in the earth, and it gets pulled and pushed and twisted and converted and finally dropped in your doorstep. So the supply chain is the story of where everything comes from.
So can you say a little bit about your role in the supply chain? Is it around making things more efficient, broadly speaking? And do a lot of companies have someone in your role?
Well, yes, there are lots of people who are supply chain executives of various kinds. I am really not a supply chain executive. I'm a supply chain researcher, which means I've worked with every company from Boeing and Lockheed to Starbucks and McDonald's. Basically, I am accountable for thinking through how all this digital revolution is going to affect the efficiency of the system. So you can be upstream, running a dairy like Land O'Lakes, for instance, is somebody I've worked with a lot. And, you like to be able to get a sense of how am I going to use computers, information technology, the internet, and how am I going to engage better with my next partner downstream. Let's say it's a supermarket who's going to basically take my milk and my butter and sell it. My job is to understand how those pieces fit together, take a look at the technology that's helping you do it. And that includes essentially, you know, a computer screen. Everybody sits on a computer screen and make these decisions. There are hundreds of thousands of people working in supply chain in different roles. The people who do what I do are really not that common because we have a luxury of getting to worry about all the supply chains in the world as researchers or academics or analysts, in effect. But the people who really do the work, people who go out there and purchase raw materials and set up and build manufacturing facilities and run giant logistics networks, that's a pretty tough day-to-day job that occupies hundreds of thousands of people who are basically some combination of engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, systems engineers, and business people. That's the combination. Economics and engineering is kind of the root of what goes on in supply chain. So lots of folks do it. The people I spend my time with, Steve, are the people who are what we call chief supply chain officers. That would be, for instance, a fellow who I've known for a long time is the chief supply chain officer of General Mills, Cheerios, Yoplait, etc. He was on CNN with an extended interview about the supply chain and food and what's going on in the supermarkets. Those kinds of people are accountable for understanding and keeping up and running literally thousands of factories all over the world that deliver your food, deliver your clothes, deliver your, you know, laptops and machinery.
Yeah.
So that's who I work with.
Kevin, I don't know if the audio is kind of choppy. If there's a way for you to adjust it or put headphones, I got a couple of them, but I can hear you, but it'd be good if you can adjust.
I can lean it a little bit, Steve, see if that's any better.
I think it's a little bit better, thanks. So the interesting piece, I looked at this may be too personal to share, but I looked at my personal Amazon history. I've never been more giddy around getting heel pads for my shoes, where I was checking outside every day. I have candy, Matchbox cars, a cell phone holder for my bike, a yoga mat, of course, a couple face masks, coffee. These are across multiple industries. And I can imagine the complexity in a particular industry. My class had a speaker from a company called Purple Carrot that does vegan home food delivery. And he talked to our class around the supply chain in that very narrow focused industry. How has Amazon become an expert across industries that are really infinite, it seems? And what's the kind of shared secret sauce that makes Amazon effective at helping across industries?
It's a great question, Steve. And it really is a pretty simple answer. We start with the customer and work backwards. That's the whole philosophy. Customer obsession is a really fundamental Amazon principle and value. And the original Amazon selling books online was really just a way to get started using the internet to take care of customers, to satisfy their desires. Once Amazon got their head around how the customer wants things delivered to them, why not try something else? Electronics, and then apparel, and then more. So that customer obsession is the first ingredient. The other ingredient, Steve, is technology. And I mentioned that in my story when I was describing how I got to where I am, because the use of information technology to keep track of all of this stuff is what's really the breakthrough. There was a time, and my first job ever was a shipper receiver in a little retail store down in the combat zone on Neeling Street, where we would take big boxes of junk from China, break it out into 7 little boxes, and send it off to our 7 little stores, 7 little malls. And we did it all with pens and paper, which is fine at a small scale. But you bring technology into that and it speeds way up, and you end up with the answer to your question, which is Amazon has a really good handle on what you want. We know what you're buying, what you like, when you want it. And it's not just the internet picking up your order. It's also an incredible amount of basically machine learning, artificial intelligence baked into the back end to figure out what you like and why and what's the best way to get it to you as promised the next day, that kind of thing. So it's that customer obsession is number one. And then being able to handle and apply all of this information technology, that's really, I think, ingredient number two, if I simplified it all down.
Yeah. So I had a question about the culture of Amazon. And I think people know of may have different perspectives on the company and how big it is and how much money the CEO may make and things along those lines. But I think one of the things that's really struck me is the role that Amazon has played in terms of providing desperately needed supplies and goods for people. I mean, the amount of people who have needed food that is delivered by Amazon, that have needed masks, I mean, literally a matter of life and death. And, you know, the second piece to that is around the role that sustainability plays in the company's ethos. So I was curious to have you, if you could share a little bit about the culture of Amazon as being a place that is doing good while also hopefully being profitable and more efficient and growing.
Well phrased question, Steve, because you got the two big hot buttons I think that matter right now. And the first one, I go back to that thought of customer obsession. And when all of a sudden people were quarantined and you were needing your basic supplies, your food, your medicine, your household needs, and the stuff you were freaked out about, like protective equipment, masks, gloves, and stuff like that. Amazon changed the prioritization. Remember I described to you the algorithms and all the machine learning about how we know what you want? Well, we went in and we changed everything so that we said, we don't really care what you want if it's not something that is essential right now. So if you were ordering something that was sort of frivolous, like let's say you
my
wanted to
heel
order
pads my heel pads for my shoes took at least 3 weeks during the. That may be an example of a
something that's
non-essential.
not essential. I'm sorry, Steve, but that's
Yes.
a perfect example. I was going to give you artificial Christmas trees, but heel pads is a pretty good example. I heard that from a lot of people. My such and such is going to take 3 weeks. Well, forget it, and they often did forget it. That's not normal. Amazon normally will get that to you the next day.
Right.
But that's because there were so many people ordering so much stuff that they had to have for life or death purposes that got prioritized. So Amazon's culture is to say, we can do something about this. Let's not just do first come, first serve. Let's do most important first, and then do things like artificial Christmas trees or heel pads later. And the sustainability question, Steve, which I did want to make sure we got to, because this is kind of my passion, I guess, in a way, is Amazon is giant, as everybody knows. And the effort that goes into minimizing carbon footprint by, for instance, buying tens of thousands of electric vehicles and optimizing in every way possible the efficiency of the routes that we run, and things like reducing the amount of packaging. It seems crazy because you get so many boxes, but believe it or not, the packaging that we use is reduced dramatically from what was standard practice even 5 years ago. And that's a quest that Amazon is on. In fact, I saw a television ad just last night about the climate pledge, which is Amazon has gone out along with a few other leading companies and promised to get to the Paris Accord goals 10 years early by 2040. And this is a product of using all that technology to try to make the most possible intelligent decisions with respect to what the customer has to have and what we owe to society. When you're this large, you really got to worry about the impact you're having. Basically, it's not just about shareholders. It's about your role in society, and Amazon's very serious about that.
And on the consumer end, any thoughts on, knowing that so many people now and before this crisis and probably in the future are so dependent on companies like Amazon, and I've certainly felt guilt around the number of boxes that I'm receiving and the amount of packaging associated with it. Any thoughts on the consumer perspective on how to improve on the sustainability side?
Yes, Steve, definitely. There are a couple things that are not obvious unless you think about it from a supply chain perspective, which is my job. If you become predictable in the way you buy things, you will be more sustainable. Surprise orders involve a lot of running around and a lot of extra waste and therefore a lot of carbon. So for instance, if you can sign up for any kind of a subscribe and save program, things like, I'm going to tout an enemy here, Chewy. Chewy is a rival of ours, but I'm going to tell you anyway. If you use Chewy to deliver your pet supplies, you're in a system that's repeatable. What happens in that kind of a situation is they have very efficient routes to drop your stuff off. They make it very efficiently so it's not lying around in piles, less inventory. And they know what they're going to need. So they don't buy more than they need and have it sitting around waiting in the factory to be packed. So predictability, things like subscribe and save type deals, are really good for sustainability. Another thing I would suggest is there are certain brands that make an effort. Now, I'm saying Amazon's making an effort, and I'm telling you a little bit about that right now. But I'll tell you about Unilever, and I will suggest that Unilever and maybe Procter & Gamble even deserves the same kind of example to be called out. But Unilever in particular has made a real effort at this. So if as a consumer, you know Unilever's brands, which are like Hellmann's mayonnaise and Ben & Jerry's and Dove, hand creams and Lipton iced tea, buy their stuff instead of somebody else's. Honestly, it's as simple as that. Now, Ben & Jerry's is absolutely a hardship on the average consumer to have to eat Ben & Jerry's. I know that's rough. But if you want to encourage a company like Unilever who's doing the right stuff, you buy from them. You buy from Columbia Sportswear, for instance. Or even Nike has done a whole lot of stuff. Understand the corporations who are good at this, and they tend to be pretty public about it, and know what brands they sell so that when you go shopping, you buy a brand that's part of a corporation who's making an effort. Yeah. And then last, I guess, of all is, if you think in terms of recycling, this is so simple and yet it's so easy to get wrong. Most recycling is thrown straight in the dumpster or landfill or incinerator because they really don't have a good way of separating the materials. So things like your plastic bottles, they shouldn't have their caps on them. And, they say clean out the containers. It's a pain, but if you don't clean out the containers, at a certain point, there's enough contamination in that load that they just won't run it through the system. So if you want to do something on sustainability, be predictable, like subscribe and save. Buy from companies who are doing the right thing, really help them. And try when you're recycling to think about how that material is going to get used again. Keep it clean, keep it organized. It's not very convenient, but it is something you can do.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. One of the things we've been talking about at school a lot is sort of the silver linings associated with some of the very challenging times that we're in right now. And I'm curious to hear your, well, in two particular areas, but then in general, sort of on two things that have become very essential on the delivery side are food and healthcare supplies. And I was curious to hear your perspective on what changed if anything, to make those particular industries more efficient. What will be lasting? And then any other thoughts you have on sort of silver linings in your world around the current crisis that we're in?
Well, first, let me see if my mic is better. Is that better?
That's great. Thank you.
Then I can kick back and relax a little bit. All right. I should have done this in the beginning. Silver linings, Steve, they're really abundant, actually. As nasty as it is to be in this situation right now, what's happening is we're discovering a lot about the way a virtual, digital, internet-enabled work world and life world can support us. I think what's happening that's going to affect not just the obvious, which is people working virtually from home are going to cut down on the amount of commuting into cities and the amount of energy spent in office buildings, and frankly, even the amount of hotel stays on business trips. All that stuff is going to drop. And I don't have any kind of an official number on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if business travel drops 30% forever. Doesn't matter about COVID. It's just a question of, do I really need to make this business trip? That's one big silver lining, is we're going to have quite a bit less of a clumsy, carbon-heavy system of getting our work done to just basically keep the economy rolling. I think the other thing is about the product itself. Increasingly, people spend money not on physical products so much as they do on experiences or content or entertainment. And companies like Amazon, for instance, or Google or Apple. Apple's an even better example. I'll give you Apple as the best possible example of this. The silver lining of this pandemic is the tilt of consumer spending away from yet more junk for your closets, more t-shirts, more plastic toys, more housewares, just less of that stuff, and more on iTunes and iMovie and everything else that you buy and consume on your Apple platform. If you look at the consumption pattern of kids, they spend a heck of a lot of their money one way or another on something that is ultimately a digital product. So the long-term trend in supply chain, but in business in general, is away from a big industrial manufacturing system that makes stuff, puts it in trucks, and sends it to you, and toward a system that adds creative value to things you often already have and makes the experience more about the content, art, as a matter of fact. In the long run, art dominates industry, and that's very hard for people to believe, but it's, I think, definitely going to be true. And I think it's going to have an effect on the kind of physical products you do buy. I think you will end up with more physical products, whether they be shoes or furniture or sporting goods, that are like fantastic, that last for a long time, that you take the time to fix like people did 100 years ago, not that are to be thrown away. And so I think you're going to end up with this great silver lining of less carbon burnt and ejected into the atmosphere to get the work done, and less carbon baked into the product itself, more of a pure digital artistic content element to the final product.
And then specifically in the worlds of food and healthcare, which is something we had talked about before this call, what are your thoughts on kind of the lasting impact on those particular supply chains?
Great question. Food, which is kind of, that's how supply chain got famous when the pandemic started. People saw empty supermarket shelves. The thought that you're not going to have your food supply chain solid is pretty scary. In reality, of course, there were very few significant shortages of food product. There was the bizarre toilet paper shortage, which I am pretty certain had nothing to do with special consumption patterns and had a lot to do with a few people freaking out and buying a bunch of toilet paper. And then since those boxes or those packs of toilet paper were so huge, all of a sudden the shelves looked empty. Panic buying led to this sort of rush on toilet paper. It made no sense. But generally, the food was there. What you did see, and what I think will be impactful in the future, is meat will go down. There will be less meat. We knew, I knew this from having worked in that, with people in that sector, that the meat processing business is very different from most other manufacturing. Most manufacturing, you take parts and you put them together. There's a bill of materials, it's called. It's how you assemble stuff. In the meat business, it's a reverse bill of materials. You start with an animal and you tear it apart. And nastiness aside, there's plenty of nastiness to think about in the meat industry. But with respect to COVID and a safe and secure supply chain, the way that animals get turned into the products we consume, which is a little plastic container of parts, is a whole bunch of people working very close to each other with knives and saws and machines. And number one, the risk of that work environment has been visible, and we've seen food shortages in the pork supply chain and the chicken supply chain just in the last few months. And number two, it's caused us to shine a light on an industry that is, I mean, I can't help but do a value judgment here on this. An industry that is nasty. I mean, I like meat, but I'm eating less, and I will continue to eat less. And I think the consumers will as well. In other kinds of food, particularly produce, there's one thing that's going to happen more and more, which is you will source locally. We will get less variety in the supermarkets with food that is shipped up from, let's say, South America during our winter, their summer. If you want to do something productive, to your earlier question, buy the food that's in season, the fruit, veg that's in season, when it's in season, and try to avoid insisting on stuff that is hard to get. It's going to be more expensive, and we're going to end up getting kind of a shift back to the old way of life, where when it was, strawberry season, they were everywhere, and when it was apple season, they were everywhere. So those things will change. They'll be more local and more regional on the food supply chain side.
I just became a vegetarian as you were speaking, Kevin, so thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry for anybody who's in the meat business. I do love, honestly, I love eating meat in certain conditions. But yeah, I'm with you, Steve. I've seen it, and it makes you want to be makes you want to be a
Yeah.
vegetarian.
So I have a couple other questions, but we're starting to get a couple questions in the chat, which I will ask. And then if others have questions you want for me to ask to Kevin, that would be great. So the first question is, what advice would you have for college students or recent grads in general, I think, but also perhaps if they're specifically interested in the work that you're doing?
Well, let me start off with specifically, because that's where I can be most useful. If you want to get into the world of supply chain, which is exciting because it's very active and it's growing very fast, you have to have some kind of a combination of engineering, material science, working with stuff, and economics, business, finance, working with money. If you like working with both stuff and money, you're going to really like supply chain. If you want to get started coming straight out of high school, you should try to get a job somewhere in the sort of entry levels of logistics. I was a shipper receiver, for instance, as I said. You could go work in an Amazon fulfillment center right now, make pretty good money, have excellent health benefits, and have a nice little resume item as you then move off into college. But generally speaking, supply chain is an industry or a sector within business that appreciates on the ground physical work that's actually out there. I think in terms of college and college grads, it is important that you get your head around data analytics. The one class I would take above all else, whether high school or college, and I think you should take as many levels of it as possible, is statistics. Statistics, now currently called data analytics or machine learning, there's various different flavors of it, but dealing with data and starting with basic statistics, which you can get at Nobles, I believe, is a great thing to make sure you study. And then upon getting out, if you can bring a data analytics mindset to a business that is got a lot of decision making about where do we source from and how do we do the shipment and what do we sell and at what price, you're going to be sitting there with the right knowledge, the right experience, and sort of right at the center point of where all of this acceleration in change in the way business gets done, where it's happening. So you can be pretty valuable at that spot.
Okay, the next question, I'm reading them from our chat box. What are your comments on the increasing supply chains difficulties given current and future U.S. and China relationship problems? What are the strategies for giant companies like Amazon to deal with those difficulties?
Diversify supply. I mean, first off, this isn't new. We hosted a conference when I was with AMR Research, one of the companies that Kate mentioned at the beginning, way back in 2008. And it was out in Phoenix, all supply chain leaders. It was called Globalization Comes Home. We had the former president of Mexico, and we talked about diversifying your supply away from China. The current trade war is crazy from a business perspective. But in terms of coping with it, to the question, really you want to either reshore or nearshore and diversify your overall inbound buying and manufacturing of everything you're doing. So whatever you sell, you want to find suppliers who are, first off, not sole source, if at all possible. You want something other than China, and preferably closer to home. Less travel, less risk, less time. Mexico in particular is a place to look for almost anything you want to buy. It's a tremendously evolved manufacturing sector. And then just outside of China, you've got places like Vietnam is particularly evolved and particularly well structured. Korea is full on high tech and not particularly low cost. And then you're going to find places like Eastern Europe. Poland is particularly well developed and evolved. So diversifying it and ideally bringing it closer to, when I say home, by the way, I mean the market. Your headquarters may be in Chicago, but if your European business unit is looking for diversified supply, ideally you'll get something in the European region and not pull it in from China.
All right, next question. Somebody noticed that there were things available in Texas that weren't in the Northeast. Question, were there logistics problems in the Northeast during quarantine?
Probably. Depends on what those things were. The quarantine in the Northeast, which is now down south, it slowed down the process. I mean, what we did at Amazon was we just basically spent a fortune. I think our analyst call at the close of the quarter included some reference to the fact we spent $4 billion on protective equipment, additional staff, additional spacing, and all of that kind of thing. That does cut into the availability of product. And if the Northeast was, if this question is focusing on something like, for instance, your heel pads, they're going to be a bit of a problem relative to life or death items. That problem will shift elsewhere. It's not necessarily just a logistics problem. It's potentially a question of prioritization. Because you could do it. It's just a question of, is it worth doing it? And at that point, it probably wasn't.
Okay. For the record, I got my heel pads. You probably noticed a spring in my step if you see me. So thank you to Amazon for that. So
I'm glad, Steve. That's good.
I had a question kind of for you as you think about, you've been at Amazon for a couple of years now, but as you think about kind of your future and things that you've not gotten to do, either personally or professionally, what are some things that you aspire to do as you look forward in your career, either within Amazon or beyond?
Well, I think I said sustainability is a bit of a passion, and I've worked on it for a long time. I introduced a sustainability practice at AMR Research many years ago, and have written about it in a lot of different contexts. I guess I want to do a lot more of that, and I'm going to keep on working on that application of this whole supply chain technology set. I think that's kind of the most important thing that there is to do out there. But if I were to throw one thing out there, it's a little bit of a curveball at you, because I have been close to the doorway and then backed away and may return. I want to go and study theology. I have this feeling that we're at this bizarre historic inflection point where the world population went from, 1 billion not that long ago to 7 billion so quickly. And yet, really, there are people starving, but nowhere near what we thought. When I was a kid in the early 60s, population explosion was this great, terror. Turns out we've more than doubled the population just in my lifetime, and the percentage that is starving is lower. What that says to me is we can do it. We can feed 10 billion people, but we can't, I don't think, be happy and successful as a human race without some kind of collective understanding of what we're trying to be and become. And when I think about it, I end up being quite philosophical. I'm not happy with Hobbes and Locke. I'm not utilitarian about it. I end up thinking that there has to be some kind of a higher level calling that brings humanity together. So that's a crazy answer, but that is something that I very well may do within the next 5 years, is return to study theology to figure out how this might all hang together.
Very interesting. Question that's relevant to the world that I live in daily, although maybe hopefully not as much so for us, but a big issue in K through 12 education is acquiring PPE to allow for the safe reopening of schools based on current health guidance, and that varies state to state, I think. Any inside tips for state buyers and their suppliers in acquiring product from the producers and manufacturers?
I wish I had a good inside tip, and I appreciate the question, Bill, because I see you in the chat, Billy Bell, also from class of 80. No, I don't have any good inside tips. We are a bit of a disaster area as a nation in terms of managing our supply and demand balance for this personal protective equipment. It's coming from all over the place, by which I mean manufactured in many locations. I think that the only real approach you can take is sort of the opposite of what I said to the China question: diversify your sources of buying. So they're buying product from various places. You're going to need to look for different choices in terms of who you can get supplies from. So I wish it were a better answer, to be honest, but there isn't anything that I'm aware of as a special inside answer on this. Be predictable, but then again, everybody wants personal protective equipment, so that should be no surprise. It's a tough one.
Yeah, so I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to ask one because it's coming from a student, Kevin Chen, who was in our class this past year. He's a 2020 graduate of Noble, so I want to give props to the most recent grad and a graduate of our entrepreneurship class. So Kevin asked, what would be the incentives for a company to work on sustainability in its practices, disregarding the moral aspects of the issue?
Well, the first one is cost. I mean, right out of the gate, carbon costs money, and that's not counting a carbon tax. Eventually, someone's going to hit us with a carbon tax. I certainly hope they would, or at least that's my view. That may not be Amazon's view, but carbon costs money. Carbon is fuel. Carbon is materials. We'd like to cut down on waste. So that's number one. Number two, consumers are very slowly, but I still think it's beginning to take root, tilting in the direction of rewarding companies who are sustainable in any fashion, whether it's about carbon or it's about responsible use of water or fair labor, which is a giant thing in the apparel industry. I spent a lot of time with those folks, and increasingly there is a revenue upside. So far, there hasn't really been solid proof that you get a premium price for having a respected sustainable supply chain. But I think that's just on the cusp of changing. So number one, it cuts costs. Number two, I believe it's going to increase sales, possibly via price premiums in the future, most likely via customer loyalty. But almost certainly it's going to enhance the value of your brand. And I'm leaving out things like avoiding penalties and the cost of lost days at work. There's a variety of things that are smaller categories, but just plain cost savings, number one, and you're going to sell more, number two.
So this question I'm literally reading because I don't understand what a lot of the letters and words mean, but given the acceleration in data algorithms, machine learning, AI, QR codes, so far so good for me on that point, but where do you see the trend in technology heading specific to SCM, which I'm assuming is supply chain something?
Yeah, it is.
How'd I do?
Yeah, artificial intelligence and the use of this kind of intensive data modeling. The acceleration in algorithms is intense. And I think that the interesting thing, we saw this a bit with COVID, there was so much abnormal behavior that the algorithms saw things that were weird and it didn't know what to do with them. So the machine learning algorithms are going to basically have to get deeper and deeper into more expansive data sets. So for instance, if you take relatively basic machine learning that does things like clustering and identifying of trends, and go deeper into sort of extrapolating the gaps in a big data set so that you can do much larger estimates of even more, variable data, you end up being able to guess some crazy stuff. I think that those trends are part of the reason I said study statistics. Those trends create opportunity for anybody who, number one, has a lot of data, and number two, equally important, maybe more important, knows how to ask questions of the data, which is why I started off with things like understand material and understand money, and you're going to be asking the right questions in supply chain. You ask those questions of a giant data set, and you start to use some of the more sophisticated machine learning algorithms. You're training it to figure out the things that you would guess as a human being just by intuition. Ultimately, it's about intuition being automated by virtue of seeing enough movement around a particular data set that you see. I think there is a trend there. I think there is a bucket there. So I think that's going to continue to accelerate. The amount of data is absolutely exploding. This questioner obviously knows all about this. And the analytics are keeping pace because the underlying microprocessor capabilities are basically moving along. And this guy probably knows about quantum computing too, which is not ready for game time yet, but quantum computing will just do a whole lot more solving with a vast data set with a lot less power and time. So I think the computational capability as well as the data sort of volumes are going to be more than we can even ask good questions of. So it's really ultimately about being able to ask a question of the data.
I understood about 25% of that, but I'm sure that the person who asked the question had a better handle on that. So this is the last question, and we're going to turn it back over to Kate. Any comments on counterfeit products or raw materials in the supply chain? Is this a major problem or not as much?
I think it's a very major problem, and it has been for a long time. You could argue it's worse because of e-commerce, simply because the sourcing
Yes.
pool is vast. I mean, you could buy from anybody. It's tough to tell what you're getting. And counterfeits, who gets hurt is kind of the question of counterfeits. If the consumer buys a counterfeit Louis Vuitton bag and likes it, well, who suffers? Well, Louis Vuitton suffers. That's one for sure. And that's basically not fair. That hurts people. That hurts business. That hurts trust. But the kind of counterfeits that really cause trouble are things like counterfeit drugs or food that is labeled safe and put into a familiar label but actually isn't, or toys, for instance, that have lead paint on them. They are sometimes counterfeit using the brand, and yet they've gone through a different process. That's actually flat out dangerous. And in some places like, I mean, in India, I don't know the percentage, I can't quote you a number, but the percentage of counterfeit pharmaceuticals that makes it to the consumer, to the patient, is staggering. We have it here. We have it everywhere, all around the world. It's a really serious problem, and it's something that can get worse. I mean, Amazon's very aggressive about stamping it out when it comes up, but the pace of the creativity of these businesses who try to take a counterfeit approach to anything from a Nike sneaker to, you know, some kind of a specialty drug. It's pretty hard to keep pace with. There are some technologies, by the way, blockchain, which I'm not going to get into because that's a massive another rat hole of tech talk. But blockchain is really particularly promising around arresting the problem of counterfeit by knowing exactly where you got not just your whole order, but this particular box, this particular batch. And that could make a pretty big difference. It's going to take 5+ years, but that could really help.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kevin. I just, as we wrap up, I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this. I know everyone's very busy right now and a kind of a crazy time, and to take an hour out of your day to speak to people across the Nobles community is greatly appreciated. I think I'm reminded every time I speak with somebody like you around our community and the stories of our community. And I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed in this conversation and in teaching my class is the ability of just providing stories to people in the Nobles community, because you covered a whole range of topics. And I know that for everyone on the call, there was something gained. And I think, and I hope I'm not offering inappropriately, but I'm sure, Kevin, if you have questions after, you can feel free via Kate Brown to reach out to Kevin. And certainly if anyone on this call is interested in connecting with current Noble students, particularly around areas of innovation or entrepreneurship, I would love to hear from you as we ramp up for our class in the coming year. So on behalf of the school, I really want to thank you. I think Kate is not coming back on screen. So thank you very much. And we hope to see all of you in the next one of these sessions this summer. Thank you.